Hi everybody, as per our conversation last night, due to the weather, I said I was going to screencast the tissues. For those who weren't in class last night, we did end early due to the weather, and I said that I was going to screencast these lectures in regards to histology, epithelial tissue, and connective tissue. And you would be responsible for this content in the midterm, which of course is in 2 weeks, which is the week after reading week. So let's get started on this set of slides first. This is histology and, sort of an introduction to the tissues I'm going to talk about. So basically, when we look at histology, histology represents tissues. So histology is the study of human tissues. And there are 4 main tissues found in the human body. So we're actually made up of 4 tissues. The first is called epithelial tissue, which is responsible for lining the body. And that can be surfaces both inner and outer. And if we look, say, for example, at a stomach organ, we know that it's hollow in the center. The lining on the inside of the hollow part of the stomach is epithelial tissue. And the lining on the outer part of the stomach is also epithelial tissue. So it lines both inner and outer. It also forms, epithelial tissue forms many or most of the glands and ducts that we find in the human body. We'll be talking a bit about that as we get a little farther in. The second type of tissue is called connective tissue, and it helps to protect and support the body and its organs. It stores energy, helps transport gases, and provides immunity. It plays a huge role. Think of us, connecting together. There is a whole lecture just on connective tissue upcoming, and you'll start to understand its importance. And connective tissue is now sort of a bit of a light shone on it in terms of the role that connective tissue does actually play in regards to pain patterns, dysfunction, on inability to perform tasks, and so forth. The third type of tissue is called nervous tissue. It acts as the communication cable of the body, which allows coordination of bodily functions. We're briefly going to discuss this, but that will be in much more depth when you get to your neuroanatomy class in semester 3. And the fourth tissue is muscle tissue, and in some cases allows movement of the body and some organs. So when we discuss muscle tissue, we're discussing skeletal muscles, which are sort of related to our clinical anatomy class. Smooth muscle, which relates to muscles that are found in blood vessels and blood vessels and organs of the body. And of course, we have cardiac muscle, which is related to the heart itself. In other words, they cause movement and they contract. They can, in some instances, provide protection. And of course, we will be discussing in-depth muscle tissue, especially skeletal muscle tissue, in the upcoming weeks of Clinical Anatomy 1. And we will be discussing the heart in this class in relationship to cardiac muscle. When we look at, where did tissues come from? And when we look at our development, when the sperm and the ovum get together and the ovum becomes fertilized, of course, cellular division starts to happen. And as it moves through development of 1 cell to 2 to 4 to 8 and so forth, within about 1 to 2 weeks after that sperm has fertilized the ovum, we start to get what are called germ layers. And germ layers, the best way to explain them is that being germinating or creating, everything grows out of these 3 layers, and there are 3 of them. The ectoderm that surrounds everything, the mesoderm that's in the middle, and the endoderm that is the deepest. So within the context of the 3 germ layers, they're considered to be embryonic tissues because they're being developed while cellular division is occurring. So they're the embryo, obviously, the fetus is later on. It's the maturation of the structures that come out of these germ layers. But these are in the early days. So 1 to 2 weeks after the sperm fertilizes the ovum, we start getting these 3 germ layers being created. And out of these 3 germ layers, all tissues and organs of the body develop. So we can see here is your germ layers here. We've got the ectoderm, as we can see here on the outside. We've got the mesoderm in the middle, and then the deepest is the endoderm here. This gets talked a whole lot more in semester 2 A&P when we talk about human development as it relates to the reproductive system. Just as a heads up here, you can see we've got what's called the primitive streak here. This will eventually go on to become the brain and the spinal cord. And of course, the oropharyngeal membrane here will go on to eventually become the oral cavity, the throat, and so forth. So you do see that there's differentiation that does occur, but everything starts off as these 3 germ layers here, the ectoderm, the mesoderm, and the endoderm. Epithelial tissue, when we look at the 4 tissues, epithelial tissue arises from all 3 layers, endo, ecto, and meso. Connective tissue and muscle tissue arise from mesoderm, and nervous tissue is derived from ectoderm. And I do ask questions in regards to the origins of the 4 tissues in this course. When we look at tissue, if we remember the hierarchy we took, remember it went from chemicals to cells to tissues to organs to organism, we can basically say that the setup of a tissue is predicated on the type of cells that it has, so it's cells, and the material that we find in the mix between the cells. So we say the basic setup of tissue is cells that we see under the microscope and the stuff that we find between the cells within the tissue. Obviously, this intercellular mix really is that structure governs function. The things that we find in the intercellular spaces really do influence what the tissue can do and what its properties are. So we can say that the mix, the intercellular mix, varies from tissue to tissue. So let's talk about epithelial tissue quickly first. Well, not quickly, there's a bunch of it. But anyways, there are 2 types of epithelial tissue. I sort of alluded to them when I began this screencast. One type of epithelial tissue lines and covers. And when you look at your skin, on your arm, hand, wherever you may be looking, this is epithelial tissue. This is a type of epithelial tissue. So we see this is seen in the skin. And you also have epithelial that lines the GI tract, the gastrointestinal tract, which means that epithelial tissue lines everything from the inside of your mouth all the way down to your anus. So you have epithelial tissue that runs through the entire system from mouth to anus. And you also have, so you have it lining the stomachs and so forth. The second type of epithelial tissue is called glandular epithelium. And this type of epithelial tissue is responsible for secretions. So glands secrete many things, sweat, oil, so forth. And this is a specialized type of epithelial tissue called glandular epithelium, which does form these glands that produce some of these compounds. So when we look at the general features of epithelial tissue, when I said earlier that we base tissues on the cells and the intracellular matrix, what's unique about epithelial tissue, because it lines, and one of the roles is to protect, the cells within epithelial tissue are very tightly packed together. Sorry, everybody, I had a phone call there, and I had to reach out to it before you heard it. So I'll just start again. So again, like I said, epithelial, any tissue is based on its cells and what's between them. Because of the role of epithelial tissue, it sort of has to be waterproof and protective and so forth. One of the general features we see with epithelial tissue is the cells are tightly packed together with very little extracellular matrix between them. So, and in some cases, they're actually fused together, or they get stuck together. We'll talk about that a little bit later in this slide set. When we look at, there can be anywhere from, an epithelial tissue can be anything from 1 cell thick to many cells thick. So single cell layers, so a single layer of epithelial tissue, we call that a simple epithelium. When we look at an epithelial tissue that has lots of layers, so multiple layers, we say multiple layers of epithelial tissue, or epithelial cells, is called a stratified epithelium. So if it's a single layer thick, it's called simple epithelium. If it's many layers thick of cells, it's called stratified epithelium. Now, epithelial tissue is avascular. So if you've done your medical terminology, what does avascular mean? Remember that the letter A means without. So this means that epithelial tissue does not have blood supply. So epithelial tissue is said to be avascular. How does it get its nutritional needs met or its metabolic needs met? That happens from the blood vessels that are found in the underlying connective tissue. So when we look at epithelial tissue, because it's a lining tissue, underneath it or deep to it, we find connective tissue. So we say that epithelial tissue is avascular. It gets its nutritional supply and removes its waste via the blood vessels of the underlying connective tissue through diffusion. Although epithelium is avascular, it does have a direct nerve supply. So we say that epithelium has a direct nerve supply, and this is a peripheral nervous system that's a sensory. So we have sensory nerves that measure tension, they measure tickle, heat, cold, vibration, and so forth, wet and dry. So they somewhat penetrate into the epithelium, which gives us sensory feeling. The cells, because they line, have what's known as a free surface, meaning it faces open air or open space. So that's said to have a free surface. And because it's the highest point of whether it's a single cell thick or multiple cells thick, it is known as the apical surface. The most outer surface is the apical surface. And this faces the outer surface. Whether that outer surface is the open space of the inside of an organ. Now that open space inside an organ is known as the lumen. So whether it faces the lumen of an organ, the open space in the organ, or it faces exterior of the body, meaning your skin. So you do have a part that you're actually looking at in touch that does face the outside world. That's known as the apical surface, but also the outer portion of an organ. So again, the inner part faces the open space inside the organ, and the outside epithelial layer faces outside the organ. They're both known as the apical surface. The bottom of the epithelial tissue, the deep part, so the bottom of the cell is known as the basal surface. So the upper part, the most superficial, is known as the apical surface, and the lowest part is known as the basal surface. And you'll see medically that quite often when we talk about structures that are deep, they're called basal or basilar. And it is attached to something called the basement membrane. So we can see here in this diagram, now we can see that this is many cells thick. So then therefore this would be a stratified epithelial tissue. We can see many, many, many cells thick. Deep to it, so up here would be so let's just go what we just talked about. Many cells thick, therefore stratified. On the top here, we can see this is the apical surface. This is facing outwards. Deep down here, this is the basal surface, the very deep part. Apical up here, basal down here. We can see the artist has drawn here a purpley kind of color, and this is known as the basement membrane. This is the glue that kind of holds the deepest parts of the epithelial tissue against, or glues it close to, the deep connective tissue. And as I said earlier, this is avascular, and it gets its needs from the blood supply that's found in the connective tissue. And you can see here that the artist has actually drawn a blood vessel here with a red blood cell. So again, apical up here, basilar down here, and we have the basement membrane. So again, we can see here, the cells have a free surface known as the apical, which we just saw, which faces the surface, whether the lumen of the organ or the exterior of the body or the exterior of an organ. And we can see the bottom of the cell is called the basal surface, which we just saw, which is attached to something called the basement membrane or another cell underneath it. In other words, if we look at an individual cell, such as this top one that we can see right here, it does have an apical surface here, which we can see, but under here it also has a basal surface. More often what we talk about is that this is the apical surface that we see here. This is the basal surface down here. And here we can see this basement membrane that kind of holds things together. Okay? And we can see we're sort of seeing a simple squamous here. So this would be a singular layer that we see here. Now the basement membrane, it's this deepest part that we see here in purple, it has two parts to it as well. So we can say that the basement membrane is a thin tissue layer which bonds the epithelium to the underlying connective tissue. As I said, it's the glue, and it has two layers. The first layer is the most apical layer, or the highest one, and that is known as the basal lamina. The reason it's called the basal lamina is because it faces the basal layer of the epithelial tissue. So basal lamina, it's the most apical segment of the basement membrane, and it contains collagen fibers which make it quite strong, and large protein carbohydrates known as proteoglycans. And we'll get into those a little bit later. The deeper layer of the basement membrane is called the reticular lamina. Now, a lamina basically means layer. So you have a basal layer, which faces the basal layer of the epithelium. And this, of course, we're talking about the basement membrane. And then the deeper layer of the basement membrane is called the reticular lamina. And the reason this is called the reticular lamina, so whereas we saw that the basal lamina contains collagen fibers, the reticular lamina contains reticular fibers, and it lies closest to the connective tissue. So the basal lamina lies closest to the epithelial tissue and has collagen fibers. The reticular lamina is closest to the connective tissue layer, which is the deepest, and it contains reticular fibers and glycoproteins, which are similar to the proteoglycans. So again, we can see in the diagram here, we'll have our upper basilar part of the basement membrane and our lower reticular part. The seventh thing about epithelial tissue is that, as I said, the cells are very, very close together with very little matrix between the cells. So we say that the epithelial tissue possesses several cellular junctions which allow for adhesion of the cells, cell communication because they're so close to each other. And as I said, epithelial tissue can be somewhat waterproof, so therefore these cellular junctions control the water flow, or how much water moves in or out of the cell at any given time. So we say control of water flow in between the cells. The other thing about epithelial tissue, it's constantly dividing and it's constantly dying off. And when we get into the integumentary system, when we get back after break, you're rubbing dead cells off your skin all the time. Every time you have a shower with a towel, you're rubbing it off. So they're constantly needing to be replaced. So we say that most epithelial tissue has a high capacity for regeneration, meaning it has a very short life. So there's constant cellular division that's happening deeply in epithelial tissue to replace the cells that get lost on the apical surface at any given time. So when we define epithelial tissue, when we look at epithelial tissue under a microscope, we discovered that within epithelial tissue, there are three common cell shapes that we find in epithelial tissue. So there are three different cell shapes. The first is called squamous. When we talk about squamous epithelium, this is an epithelial tissue where the cells are flat like tiles, and squamous actually means fish scales. So we can see here is a simple squamous epithelium here, and we can say simple, therefore it's one layer thick of cells. Squamous because the shape of those cells are scale shaped or tile shaped. Simple, one layer, and our basement membrane we can see here in purple, and squamous because of the shape of the cell. The second type of epithelial tissue we have is called cuboidal. And that name kind of speaks of itself. This type of epithelial tissue has cells that are shaped cube, in a cube way. So we can see here, again, we have simple, one layer, cuboidal, and we can see the cells are somewhat cuboidal in shape. Again, here's our basement membrane that we can see here. Basal layer facing the epithelium, reticular layer facing the connective tissue underneath. The cells are cubed in shape, so one layer thick, so simple cuboidal epithelium. Our third shape of epithelial tissue is called columnar. And this is a type of epithelial tissue that has very tall cells. And they can be somewhat triangular in shape, so like a column, hence its name. So here we can see a columnar tissue. It is simple because it is only one layer thick. We'll get into these a little bit more in the next slide set. But it is one layer thick, you can see here, so it is simple. And because the cells are very, very tall, it's known as columnar epithelium. And again, here's our basement membrane. Here's our connective tissue layer here. There is microvilli and things on here and mucous membranes, but we're going to get more deeply into this in the coming slide. So we'll just talk about this from the shape of the cells for now. So again, columnar, the cells are tall and somewhat triangular in shape. There is another type of tissue that we find in one place in particular. It is known as transitional epithelium. This particular tissue has cells in it that vary in shape. So it has cells which can vary in shape from squamous, flat, to cuboidal, cube-shaped, to columnar tall. And where we find this is in the urinary bladder. So why would we have a transitional tissue? The whole purpose of the transitional tissue is it allows for expansion or dilation. So imagine, if you will, you have your bladder, which of course is going to start to fill up with urine. And as it fills up with urine, the bladder gets larger because you're getting an increase in volume of urine. So the urinary bladder becomes larger and larger to accept the urine. This ability for the urinary bladder to get larger and hold more urine is because it is lined with transitional epithelium. So these epithelial layers, as I said, if there is only one layer of cells, the tissue is called simple epithelium. And I see here I've spent epithelial wrong. Simple epithelium, why have it? Its function is to allow things to move through it or absorb it. So we say simple epithelium usually functions as an absorptive or filtration tissue. For example, it lines the tissues in the lung, which allows carbon dioxide and oxygen to freely pass through. But because it's only a single layer thick, it's not good at resisting abrasion or wear, right? It can't take any kind of trauma. It tears very easily. If there are two or more layers of cells, we've talked about this, it is known as stratified epithelium. This tissue is not so good at filtration and absorption because it's thick, but it's extremely good at resisting abrasion and wear. The next type is a less common form known as pseudo-stratified epithelium. If you remember, pseudo kind of means fake. And the reason it's called pseudo is because it appears to have several layers of epithelial cells, but it doesn't. It's just that not all the cells reach the apical surface. So we can see here there are cells here that don't seem to get to the apical surface, but they are only a single cell. So this is called pseudo-stratified because it looks like there's a number of layers here, but in fact there's actually only one. So when we talk about, back here, we talk about simple epithelium and stratified epithelium. We remember that simple epithelium represents just a single layer of cells, and that stratified epithelium represents a number of layers of cells. Therefore, when we classify an epithelial tissue, you determine how many layers it has, simple versus stratified, and it's then named as the shape of its most apical cell. So we classify it. Has it got one layer of cells or many layers of cells, simple or stratified? And then what is the shape of the most apical cell? That's what names the tissue. So my question is here, if there are several layers of cells and the most apical cell is cuboidal, what would we call this epithelial tissue? several layers, and the most apical cell is cuboidal. It would be known as stratified cuboidal epithelium. So, a picture, if you will, you're riding your bike and you wipe out and you slide along the road and get some road rash. There is damage that's done to the skin, but why didn't it just break apart? Why is it scraped and scratched, but it just didn't peel off? Why didn't it just break apart? So in other words, how does tissue be held together, and why doesn't our skin just break apart? This has to do with very specialized structures, which actually in some cases, shall we say, glues cells together and keeps them tightly bound and strong. We can see that there are five things here that can hold cells together. So we've got a particular single cell that we see here, another part of one here, another part of one over there. Here's our basement membrane, and we can see there are a number of ways that cells can be held together, and that's what we're going to talk about here now. They are broken down, so this is the big picture together, and here they are individually, and we are going to discuss them individually here. So these are known as cellular junctions. We can see them here, the 5 of them. And they are specialized areas of the cell. They can be found, these junctions can be found in muscle and nerve tissue, but very rarely do we see cellular junctions in connective tissue. Where they're most common is in epithelial tissue. And there are 5 main cell junctions. The first is known as a zona occludens, or a tight junction. I will use both names, so too do authors. So a zona occludens, or tight junction. This represents a zone or band between 2 adjacent cell membranes in which the portions of the 2 membranes actually touch. So we can see here in this diagram, we can see our 2 plasma membranes of a cell here on either side, and we can see that the membranes actually touch at these points. They're actually touching. This type of junction limits passage of compounds between the adjacent cells, and through limiting, it also allows. So it allows some things through and not others. But because they're touching, cellular transport between cells is improved where they touch, okay? These tight junctions, or zona occludens, are found very high up when we think of the depth of tissue, especially in a stratified tissue. They're found in the higher parts of the tissue. So we say that these zona occludens, or tight junctions, are found close to the apical surface of the cells. And because they make tissues waterproof, we find them in places like the epithelium of the GI tract and the urinary bladder. So this binding together here, we can see that this is so tight that it makes it very difficult for liquids to pass through. If any of you here in class are actually spot welders, this will look very familiar to you. These transmembrane proteins actually glue together, one on either side of the membranes that are touching, and these transmembrane proteins glue the membranes together, making them tight and waterproof. Okay, very similar to like spot welding. Our second type of cell junction is known as the zona adherens, or an adherens junction. And these are zones between adjacent cell membranes which help bind the cells together, but the membranes do not touch. So in the tight junction, the membranes touch. In the adherens junctions, the membranes do not touch. What happens is there's a particular compound that sits in the space between the cell membranes. So we say, in the space between the membranes, we find a glycoprotein compound, which can act as a binding compound. So we can see here, we have our membrane here of one cell, we have our membrane here of another. And we have these transmembrane glycoproteins here. In this case, are called coherin. If you look at any glue out there that you use to glue things together, most of them tend to have protein as part of them. So the cells are utilizing proteins to create a bit of a glue. And you'll see that these transmembrane glycoproteins, they do face out into the space outside the membrane, and they do touch each other, one from each membrane. And you can see that if you want to call it the root or the base of the transmembrane protein is embedded in each individual cell membrane, which helps hold the two membranes together, but there is a space, and the cells, the membranes do not touch. On the cytoplasmic surface, so on the inside of the cell membrane, there is a light plaque on the surface, and it binds to microfilaments of the cytoplasm. So you can see here, it's almost like a toothpaste, if you want to call it that, the kind of lines here. And you can see that it is strengthened by embedding microfilaments within this protein paste, okay? This is known as an adhesion belt. And if you, again, have anybody in the family or you yourself are in any kind of construction, how do we make concrete stronger? We put rebar in it and then pour the concrete over top. This is exactly the same theory, is that you have this particular plaque that's here, and then you embed these microfilaments in here, in this case they're actin filaments, and they help strengthen this plaque, at which the transmembrane proteins that have passed through the membrane actually anchor into, which you can see it here. Again, the cytoplasmic surface of the cell membrane has a light plaque on its surface, which binds to microfilaments of the cytoplasm. This type of junction is usually found just inferior to the zona occludens. So we have this waterproof type here of the tight junction or the occludens, and then we have the adherence junctions, which again provides the glue and holds the cell membranes together, but the membranes do not touch. The third type of cell junction is called a gap junction. This type of junction is not a zone or a belt, but rather it's a spot between 2 points on the cell membranes. Again, the cell membranes do not touch, but instead we find small protein channels. These protein channels are known as connexons, and what they do is they bridge the gap between the cell membranes. So you can see here, we have these connexons that bridge the gap between the membranes, but again, the membranes do not touch. There's a gap here, but we do have this tubular system of connexons that do move from one membrane to the other, okay? So they bridge the gap between the cell membranes. Within these connexons, there is a fluid, so they are known to be fluid-filled channels, and their whole role is to allow ions and small molecules, such as amino acids, to easily and quickly pass from one cell to another. So these provide compounds and substances to very easily and quickly pass from one cell to another. This also allows for something called an action potential. This is the stimulation that the nervous system gives, for example, muscle cells to contract. You've got one point where a neuron attaches to a muscle cell, and then that stimulation passes entirely along the cell. The muscle cell itself has a long way to go, or the muscle cells, within the sarcomeres. And these connexons, these gap junctions, allow that action potential to quickly travel from one cell to the next, allowing the potential to move very quickly through the muscle. Interestingly enough, cancer cells do not have gap junctions, and therefore the cells don't talk very well to each other, and it's one of the reasons why tumor cells of cancer grow quite large and out of control, because they don't really talk to each other. The next are known as desmosomes. Now, these are similar to adherens in the way they're built up. And remember, this back here is the adherens, okay, with the plaque and the transmembrane proteins. So this is similar, but these are spots, not zones. Again, the cell membranes are not joined, and in fact, within desmosomes, the intracellular space is larger, it's greater, in the desmosomes than it was in the adherens junction. So the cell membranes are actually farther apart in desmosomes. There is a glycoprotein compound in the intracellular space, but it is much thicker. So we can see a larger space here between the two cell membranes and a much larger, thicker transmembrane protein that's sticking the two cells close together, but again with space in between. We can still see here, right? We've got these transmembrane proteins with these stalks or roots, again, that travel through the cell membrane and will anchor into another plaque again. So the glycoprotein in the intracellular space is much thicker, and there is a fairly thick plaque attached to the cytoplasmic side of the cell membrane. And instead of microfilaments, in here is intermediate filaments. So this is a far stronger attachment as compared to adherens. So adherens had a smaller transmembrane protein. It had a lighter plaque and a very thin microfilament. Desmosomes have a much thicker glycoprotein between the two cell membranes. And on the cytoplasmic side, the plaque is much thicker and stronger, and we have much larger filaments. So therefore, this is all building to be a far stronger attachment between cells, you can see here, as compared to the adherens, which we see here. So it's a much stronger connection. So we can say these are probably a stronger site of bonding between cell membranes. Our last ones are called hemidesmosomes. So remember that this is a desmosome, two sides. Hemi actually means half. So this means this is half of a desmosome. So these are found on that basal surface of the epithelial cells next to the basement membrane. It is these hemidesmosomes that glue or tightly connect the bottom part of the deepest cells to the connective tissue layer. So since there is no corresponding desmosome structure on the basement membrane, sorry, I said connective tissue, I meant the basement membrane. These are known as hemi. So we can see here, here's your basement membrane. Here's your thick transmembrane proteins again, right? And then we still have this thicker plaque and these very powerful intermediate filaments. So you can see because there is no corresponding desmosome in the basement membrane, it's only half of a desmosome. Therefore, it's called a hemidesmosome as compared to a full desmosome, which we see here. Okay, this is the first set done. Thanks. There's two more to come. Thanks for listening.